The giant hug. What do you want to send Granny for her birthday? Owen's mother asked. A giant hug, Owen replied. He opened his arms as wide as he possibly could to show how giant the hug would be. Do you want to draw a picture of you hugging Granny? His mother asked. No, Owen said. I want to send a real hug. I'll give the mailman a hug and ask him to send it to Granny. They gathered their letters and walked to the post office in town. Soon they got to the front of the line, and Mr. Nevin called out, Next! I want to mail a hug to my Granny. Will you please send it? Owen asked in his most polite voice. Well, we don't normally send hugs, but I suppose we could give it a try, Mr. Nevin said. Owen's mother wrote down Granny's address to Mr. Nevin. Owen walked behind the counter and opened his arms as wide as he possibly could, and he gave Mr. Nevin a giant hug. Please make the hug just as giant when you pass it to the mailman, Owen said. Oh, I won't see the mailman who delivers it to your Granny. I give the mail to Miss Potter, who sorts it and puts it on a truck to the big city. After that, it's put on a plane and flown across the country, Mr. Nevin said. Well, you will have to hug Miss Potter then, Owen said, as Mr. Nevin carried the mail to Miss Potter. Mr. Nevin looked down awkwardly at Miss Potter as he handed her the mail and the address of Owen's Granny. He blushed and mumbled, and here's a hug. Mr. Nevin opened his arms as wide as he possibly could and gave Miss Porter a giant hug. Miss Porter smiled as she sorted the mail. Just then the driver came to collect the mail bound for the big city. As the driver lifted the last heavy bag of mail, Miss Porter said, Leroy, one more thing. Someone is sending a hug to his Granny. Here's the address, and here's a big hug. Miss Porter opened her arms as wide as she possibly could and gave Leroy a giant hug. Leroy laughed and said, Now that's a piece of mail you don't see very often. Leroy whistled on his way to the big city. After unloading the mail, he checked the schedule to see who was delivering the mail to the airport. It was James. Leroy found James in the break room eating his morning snack. Hi, James. I know it seems a little odd, but a hug is being sent through the mail to someone's Granny, and this is her address, Leroy said. Leroy opened his arms as wide as he possibly could, and he gave James a giant hug. James cringed. He was not the hugging type, but it did its job. Later that afternoon, James arrived at the airport. He asked a mail handler when the mail was being loaded onto the plane. That mail was taken to the plane a few minutes ago, the mail handler said. James rushed to the plane, where Captain Johnson was getting ready to board. Captain, the kid is sending a hug through the mail to his Granny. Here's the address and here's the hug, James said with a grimace. James opened his arms as wide as he possibly could and gave Captain Johnson a giant hug. When the plane landed, Captain Johnson walked to the airport post office. He saw Amanda standing next to the mail truck, and he said, Hello, are you driving the truck? A hug is being sent through the mail, Captain Johnson announced. Captain Johnson opened his arms as wide as he possibly could and gave Amanda a giant hug. Amanda brightened and said, Thank you. She bobbed her head to the music as she drove and unloaded the mail. Amanda went to find Chad, the driver, to take to Granny's town. Chad, a hug is being sent through the mail. Here's the address. Chad chuckled and said, Finally, do you want to go dancing tonight? I'd love to, Amanda explained. Chad kicked up his heels and hopped into the truck. Early the next morning, Chad drove to Granny's house. As he prepared to return to the city, he remembered the hug. Who will be delivering the mail to Pennside today? Chad asked the supervisor. Shelley, but she's not here yet, Mr. Greenberg replied. Please pass along to her, Chad said. Chad opened his arms as wide as he possibly could, and he gave Mrs. Greenberg a giant hug. Mrs. Greenberg gasped with surprise. Shelley, I need a word with you, she called when Shelley arrived. A hug is being sent through the mail to a boy's Granny, and you are the mail woman delivering it. Mrs. Greenberg opened her arms as wide as she possibly could and gave a giant hug. "Granny will be delighted," Shelley exclaimed. Shelley stopped to smell the flowers as she delivered the mail from door to door. She saw Granny gardening in the yard. "Mrs. Lewis, I have a special delivery for you," Shelley said. "Your grandson has sent you a hug." Shelley opened her arms as wide as she possibly could and gave Granny a giant hug. Granny grinned and said, "That's the most wonderful piece of mail I have ever received." And Granny puckered up her lips and gave Shelley a big old kiss. And look, it ended up back on Owen. I wish that we could all give hugs right now. Maybe soon we'll be able to.